The desert runway shimmered beneath the blazing afternoon sun as the ground crew moved through their routine with practiced focus, unaware that the day was about to turn into something none of them would forget. And among the scattered tool carts, fuel hoses, and humming generators stood a young crew chief who kept glancing toward the horizon, waiting for the familiar shape of an A10 returning from its patrol, yet the radio remained crackling with empty static, offering no sign, no voice, no reassuring update from the pilot they trusted most. And as the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence, the crew felt something unwelcome crawling into their thoughts, a whisper of worrying that deepened with each moment without word from the sky, leaving them staring upward with growing unease. The pilot flying today was known for her steady, calm presence, the kind of aviator who could take a battered aircraft and coax it home even through storms that turned the desert sky into a blur of dust and fire. And she had launched early that morning with the confidence of someone who understood the land and its dangers better than most. Yet as the hours passed and the mission window narrowed without the usual check-ins, the base began to quiet as if holding its breath, and technicians who normally joked and shouted across the flight line now spoke in hushed tones, listening for any flicker of communication from her A10, but every scan returned only static. And the commander, pacing near the calm tent, felt the unmistakable edge of dread creeping into his thoughts as he waited for a signal that stubbornly refused to come. The silence grew heavier when another patrol aircraft returned, reporting turbulence, dust, and enemy interference farther north near the ridge where she was last supposed to fly. And though they had not seen her aircraft, they reported glimpses of smoke drifting over the canyon, suggesting some kind of contact had taken place. And the moment that detail reached the crew, the atmosphere shifted in a way no one wanted to acknowledge, because smoke in that region never meant anything simple. And the ground crew chief grabbed his headset, pressing it tight against his ears while calling her name again and again, hoping for even a fragment of her voice to break through the static. Yet the radio answered with nothing but cold, unbroken emptiness, leaving the base suspended in a waiting game with stakes too high to ignore. The commander gathered the crew near the edge of the runway, briefing them quickly on what little they knew, and he ordered the rescue teams to prepare in case they needed to deploy toward the ridge, while technicians checked telemetry logs, trying to pinpoint the last known moment her A10 transmitted anything. But the data ended abruptly, mid-report cut off so sharply it felt as though the desert itself had swallowed her signal. And as the truth of that sudden silence settled over everyone, the crew felt a tightening in their chests, because they had all seen pilots vanish into the desert storms before, swallowed by cliffs, dust, and hostile fire. Yet this time felt somehow different, colder, heavier, as though the land knew something they did not and was waiting to reveal it in its own time. As the sun continued its slow descent, painting the sand in darkening shades of gold, while the winds shifted across the runway, carrying traces of dust that stung the eyes, and the crew chief stood at the far edge of the tarmac, staring into the distance, refusing to look away, because he believed she would return even if the evidence around him suggested the opposite. And memories flickered in his mind of her calm laugh, her steady voice, the way she spoke of the sky as if it were something she understood more deeply than anyone else on base. And he told himself that if anyone could fly through a storm of smoke and danger and still make it back, it would be her. Yet even that belief began to tremble as the last light faded and the horizon remained empty, leaving him clutching his headset as a final lifeline to hope. Just as the desert twilight settled over the base, a faint rumble touched the air, so soft that the ground crew chief wondered if he had imagined it. And he turned his head toward the horizon, scanning the shifting haze, until another rumble followed, deeper and more ragged, like a wounded beast struggling to breathe. And the crew snapped to attention, their eyes straining to pierce the swirling dust that rose between them and the open sky. And the commander shouted for the fire team to stand by, because a sound like that meant damage, meant trouble, meant an aircraft fighting to stay in the air. And as the rumble grew louder, echoing across the sand with uneven shudders, the crew realized that whatever was coming toward them was no ordinary landing approach, and their hearts hammered with the possibility of what that meant. A dark shape finally emerged from the curtain of dust, weaving unsteadily through the fading light, and as it grew clearer, the crew saw the unmistakable form of an A10 flying dangerously low, its wings trembling, its tail dragging a streak of smoke that cut a jagged line across the sky, and then someone shouted, pointing at the underside of the aircraft where the landing gear should have been extended, yet the space was empty, scarred and torn as though ripped clean away by some violent force, and the realization swept through the crew like a jolt of electricity. That she was alive, she was fighting, she was bringing the aircraft home on nothing but willpower and instinct. But without landing gear, the A-10 could not land without tearing itself apart, and the ground crew chief felt his breath catch as he stared at the descending aircraft, knowing the next moments would decide everything, while the sky darkened above them with the promise of what was still to come. The battered A-10 drifted lower through the thickening desert dusk, its silhouette wobbling as if each gust of wind threatened to tear it from the sky, and the ground crew scattered across the runway, scrambling into positions they had practiced but never expected to use in a moment like this, because they all knew that a gearless landing was not a landing at all. It was a controlled crash, one that demanded perfect timing, luck, and nerves steady enough to stand against fear, and the commander barked orders to prepare the emergency foam trucks while the medics rushed to the edge of the tarmac, their stretchers ready, their eyes locked on the trembling aircraft above them as its engines sputtered in uneven coughs that rang like warnings through the darkening air, leaving everyone bracing for whatever would come next. The ground crew chief raised his headset, calling out her name one last time, hoping to hear even a whisper of her voice through the static, but the radio crackled in cold silence, refusing to grant them the reassurance they sought, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, imagining her in the cockpit fighting smoke, injury, exhaustion, and a machine that looked ready to fall apart beneath her hands, and he wondered whether she could even see the runway through the haze, or whether she was flying by sheer instinct, trusting that the airstrip lay ahead somewhere in the gathering dark, and that her crew was waiting for her to bring the wounded A-10 home. And as he opened his eyes again, he saw the aircraft dip dangerously once more, leaving him gripping his headset so tightly his knuckles turned white as he waited for the next sign of disaster. The foam trucks roared to life, spraying thick white sheets across the runway, coating the ground in a slippery cushion meant to catch the belly of the aircraft and prevent it from erupting into flames on impact, while firefighters in heavy gear positioned themselves on either side, ready to charge forward at the first spark, and the commander surveyed the scene with a clenched jaw, knowing they were preparing for something that could still cost the pilot's life despite all their preparation, because A-10s were built to survive hits from enemy fire. But they were not meant to slide across a runway on raw metal without wheels, and he raised his binoculars, focusing on the trembling wings, the scorched tail, the jagged edges of what remained of the landing gear, and he whispered under his breath that she had to hold it together for just a little longer, though the shadows stretching across the sand seemed to challenge that hope. As the aircraft approached the final stretch of sky above the runway, the pilot at last broke through the radio static, her voice strained and thin as if she were fighting for breath with every word, and the crew chief froze at the sound of her speaking, his throat tightening as she reported limited control, failing hydraulic smoke in the cockpit, and rapidly dropping visibility. And though her tone remained steady beneath the strain, the details told the crew everything they needed to know: that she was flying on muscle memory, alone, wrestling a machine that no longer wanted to obey her, and that this landing would be one of the most dangerous attempts the base had ever witnessed. And as she ended her transmission with a sharp hiss of pain, the crew chief felt fear stab through him, sharper than anything he had felt before, leaving him gasping. As the A-10 dipped again into its descent, the aircraft drifted lower, still so low the crew could see sparks flicker from beneath its belly as metal brushed the first hints of foam, and the SEALs training nearby stopped mid-stride, turning toward the runway as the massive machine skimmed past them, trailing smoke and sand in a violent swirling wake, and the wind from its passage buffeted their faces, carrying the scent of burning oil and scorched paint, reminding them how close the pilot was to losing control, and the A-10 wavered dangerously as one wing dipped too far, prompting shouts from the ground crew who braced for the aircraft to flip, but with a sudden surge, the pilot corrected the tilt with a final burst of strength, forcing the aircraft level for the last precious seconds before impact, leaving everyone holding their breath as those seconds slipped away. The moment the A-10 struck the runway, it carved a screaming metallic roar across the foam-coated concrete, sparks exploding like scattered fireflies in the gathering dark, and the belly scraped with such violence that the ground vibrated beneath the crew's boots, sending tremors through their legs and rattling equipment nearby, and the aircraft skidded forward at terrifying speed, trailing a river of molten metal as its undercarriage tore itself apart inch by inch, and fire licked at the edges of its wings whenever sparks touched the leaking fuel, though the foam smothered the flames just as quickly, keeping disaster at bay by only the thinnest margin, and the pilot fought inside the cockpit to keep the machine from spinning as the A-10 veered left then right in wild lunges that threatened to send it rolling into a deadly tumble, but somehow she held on. Somehow she kept it sliding upright. Somehow she refused to let the aircraft die before it reached the end of the runway, leaving everyone stunned by her impossible control as the Warthog slowed in a tortured drag across the concrete. The nose cone dug into the foam, sending a wave of white spray bursting upward around it like a cresting wave, and the cockpit canopy shimmered in the light, revealing only faint movement inside the shadows, making it impossible for the ground crew to determine her condition, and the medic team surged forward, but the commander held up a hand signaling for caution because the aircraft was still moving, still hissing, releasing smoke and heat and fuel that could ignite if disturbed too quickly, and the A-10 groaned one final time before it lurched to a complete stop, its wings sagging toward the ground as though the machine itself were finally surrendering to the damage it had endured, and the silence that followed felt impossibly heavy as every eye locked on the motionless aircraft, waiting for the signal to Russian. When the commander finally shouted the "all clear," the ground crew sprinted across the tarmac, foam sloshing around their boots as they raced to reach the cockpit before smoke filled the interior completely, and they slammed ladders against the side of the battered fuselage, climbing toward the canopy, which was jammed half shut, warped by heat and impact, and the crew chief climbed first, pounding against the glass and calling out to the pilot, hoping for any sign that she was conscious, but the only response was the faintest movement inside, like a gesture too small, too weak to be fully seen, and the chief shouted for the cutting torch because the canopy refused to budge, and time pressed against them like a tightening vice, leaving no room for delay. The team ignited the torch, sparks flying as they sliced through the warped metal around the frame, while firefighters drenched the surrounding surfaces with foam to keep any stray flame from igniting the leaking fuel that dripped steadily from the torn underbelly of the aircraft, and the smell of burning metal mixed with smoke and fear as the crew worked with frantic precision, knowing each second mattered. And the chief kept calling her name, hearing nothing in return, until finally the last piece of twisted metal fell away, and the canopy lifted with a groaning creak, revealing the pilot slumped forward, her helmet cracked, her visor smeared with soot, and her hands still gripping the controls with a force that spoke of sheer, unbroken will. And the chief felt a surge of relief that she was alive, yet also a jolt of dread as he reached into the cockpit, realizing how badly she seemed hurt. The medics moved in as soon as the pilot was freed, lifting her gently onto a stretcher, while her flight suit peeled away in scorched patches, revealing bruises and cuts and burns from the smoke-filled cockpit, and her breathing came in ragged, shallow pulls that made the medics exchange grim glances, because she had clearly pushed her body far beyond its limits to bring the A-10 home. And the crew chief walked beside her as they carried her to the emergency tent, his face pale as the weight of what she had endured settled into his thoughts, and he found himself wondering what had torn away the landing gear, what had forced her into such a desperate return, and why she had continued flying instead of ejecting when the aircraft should have been impossible to control, leaving those questions hanging like shadows as she slipped toward unconsciousness inside the medical tent. The pilot drifted in and out of awareness, her eyes half open as she tried to speak, her lips forming words that would not quite emerge, and the medics urged her to rest, but the determination in her eyes said she needed them to hear something too urgent to wait, and she lifted a shaking hand pointing toward the distant ridge where the dust storms raged. Earlier that day, and the commander, who had hurried to the tent, leaned over her asking what she had seen, what had happened, what had taken her landing gear and forced her into a silent, desperate return, and she tried to speak again, but only fragmented. Sounds came out, leaving the commander feeling the chill of unanswered questions crawling through the silence that followed. The crew chief stepped forward, asking gently whether the enemy had found her, whether she had engaged in combat, whether she had been hit by a strike from the hidden gun nests rumored to exist in the far canyon, but her expression shifted to something more troubled, something deeper than fear, and she shook her head weakly as if denying that the threat had come from enemy fire at all, and she tried again to form a word, a single clear word, but her strength failed halfway through, and her eyes closed, though her hand remained lifted, pointing unwaveringly toward the same patch. The first pale light of dawn stretched across the desert runway, casting long, wavering shadows over the broken A10 and the ground crew, who remained in a tense semicircle around it as if waiting for a signal that would not come, and the commander moved between the scattered technicians and medics, his gaze flicking toward the ridge beyond the dunes where the pilot had pointed hours earlier, and though the aircraft rested in quiet defeat, the air carried a lingering tension, the kind that presses on your chest and fills your ears with imagined noises, and he knew instinctively that the mission was far from over, that the danger had never left, only paused, waiting for the sun to reveal what the darkness had been hiding, leaving every man poised on the edge of fear and anticipation. In the medical tent, the pilot stirred weakly, opening her eyes to half-light. She scanned the room, her gaze sharp despite exhaustion. Blood streaked across her helmet and burns blackened the edges of her flight suit, and when the crew chief leaned closer, she lifted a trembling hand, pointing once more toward the distant ridge, and her lips moved in fragments, forming a single repeated word that chilled the medics and SEALs alike, because though weak, it carried certainty, urgency, and a promise of something hidden and unseen that could change everything, and they all leaned closer, straining to hear even the faintest whisper, as if hearing it would keep the threat at bay. Yet the desert outside remained silent and indifferent to their waiting, leaving the words hanging unresolved. The commander stepped out of the tent, taking binoculars in hand, and scanned the desert through the early morning haze, the sand shifting and curling into miniature storms with every gust of wind, and the ridge rose in the distance like a jagged sentinel carved from shadow, and he noted unusual shapes half hidden by the blowing dust, formations that did not resemble natural rock or terrain, and his stomach tightened. Because they did not appear static, the shapes seemed to move, shift, reposition with a mechanical precision that defied nature, and he lowered the binoculars, exchanging a glance with the SEAL team leader, who nodded with the same understanding that whatever the pilot had seen had not been random, had not been natural, and both knew that the extraction of the reconnaissance team had revealed only the beginning of a far deeper threat, leaving the entire base poised on a knife edge. The medics stabilized the pilot as she continued to mumble in broken phrases, referencing vehicles, underground equipment moving in patterns like ants through tunnels, and men with markings none of the intelligence files had ever identified. And as she struggled to articulate the vision she had witnessed, the crew realized that it had been more than a simple engagement, more than an ambush. She had flown into the center of something organized, ancient in planning, and merciless in intent, and she had returned to warn them, and even now her voice carried the weight of something they could not yet comprehend, leaving the medics exchanging tense looks as they understood the stakes were far higher than a gearless landing or a near-fatal sortie, leaving them grasping at fragments of information they feared to hear fully. The SEAL team prepared for immediate deployment, their vehicles rolling forward, engines low to keep noise minimal, while packs full of gear strapped tight and weapons checked for function. The team leader briefed them in hushed tones, outlining a route toward the ridge and the hidden excavation site the pilot had tried to indicate, and every man felt the weight of unknown danger pressing against them, a tangible force in the chilled Don Air and the commander joined them, giving final orders that blended caution with urgency because he understood that whatever lay in the desert beyond those dunes was not idle and had probably been tracking the base through the night, and the SEALs felt a shiver of anticipation because the mission that began as a standard reconnaissance rescue had transformed into a pursuit of something larger, older, and more relentless than they had imagined, leaving them straining to see what the desert had concealed. They advanced across the dunes carefully, the tires of their Humvees crunching over hardened sand and the distant ridge growing closer with every rolling moment, yet the desert seemed to conspire against them, swirling dust into deceptive shapes and shadowed hollows, and the team moved with disciplined caution, scanning for any sign of movement because even a single misstep could trigger the unknown force they were approaching, and the SEALs exchanged silent signals as the horizon twisted and the heat mirage giving hints of structures the human eye struggled to verify, and the ground seemed to hum with an imperceptible vibration as if the earth itself anticipated their arrival, leaving the team tense, alert, their instinct screaming that they were not alone in the expanse beyond the dunes. Finally, they reached the edge of the hidden excavation, a canyon partially filled with sand and the remnants of heavy equipment half buried and motionless yet strangely arranged as if left deliberately to mislead observers, and the SEALs dismounted, scanning the shadows with weapons raised, their night vision adapting to the dim light, while the pilot, pointing from her stretcher, directed the commander toward what appeared to be the entrance to a concealed tunnel, partially collapsed but still passable, and the team leader felt a prickle of unease as he realized this was no ordinary hidden cache, no simple ambush. The layout suggested an organized structure capable of housing personnel, machinery, and intelligence beyond their initial calculations, leaving them staring at the yawning dark hollow and questioning what could be waiting inside. First, operators moved cautiously into the tunnel, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, revealing walls reinforced with metal panels, machinery stacked in neat rows, and crates stamped with symbols no one recognized, and the air was thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of something chemical and unfamiliar. And as they progressed deeper, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber filled with a hum of machinery, barely audible yet distinctly rhythmic, and the operators froze briefly, realizing the sound was deliberate, something functioning on its own timing, something alive in purpose, and they signaled silently to each other to proceed slowly, knowing that one wrong step could set off alarms or worse, traps that had been long prepared. And the faint shadows shifting on the wall suggested more than just machines watching, leaving the team tense and calculating their next move. Suddenly, a faint movement flickered in the corner of the chamber, a shadow that did not match the machinery, and the operators instinctively raised their weapons and trained their night vision toward it, and the light caught a figure crouched behind a crate, the outline human yet unnatural in posture, and the figure froze as if aware of their observation but did not move in a normal pattern, suggesting caution or training beyond what they had expected. And the SEAL team leader signaled the operators to hold their position while he advanced slowly, the hum of machinery masking their approach, and as he drew closer, the figure made a subtle motion pointing deeper into the structure as if urging them onward, and the operators' eyes widened as they realized it had not tried to flee, suggesting that whatever or whoever they were dealing with was expecting them and had a purpose still hidden, leaving the team frozen between advancing and retreating deeper into the chamber. They found a control room, partially intact, screens flickering with low power showing maps, schematics, and readings they could not immediately comprehend, yet the layout suggested intelligence operations planned with precision and sophistication far beyond local insurgents or known hostile forces. And the SEALs spread out, checking each panel, noting that the machinery hummed in patterns synchronized across multiple points, suggesting a system alive with monitoring capability, leaving them realizing that the pilot's warning had only scratched the surface of what they were walking into, and the room itself seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension, waiting for the team to make a choice to engage, observe, or retreat, while the distant echo of movement suggested they were not alone. A sudden metallic clatter echoed from the far end of the tunnel, a sound so deliberate it could not be dismissed as accidental, and the team froze listening to the subtle vibrations in the air as a second figure emerged from the shadows, its movements smooth and deliberate, and the operators realized the structure was staffed far more extensively than intelligence reports had indicated, and as the figure approached the nearest panel, it gestured sharply toward the operators and then back toward the inner chambers as if demanding they follow, and though hesitant, the team leader understood instinctively that this was no ordinary adversary, yet retreat was no longer safe because the excavation had been activated, and whatever lay within had noticed them, and the operators' hearts pounded as they moved forward into the darkened tunnels, following a guide whose allegiance remained unclear, leaving the unknown dangers multiplying with every step further inside the tunnels. The SEALs found more signs of life machinery in motion, crates shifting with subtle automation and maps indicating routes far beyond the desert surrounding them, and the operators realized the pilot's reconnaissance had been only the first step, and the structure was part of a far larger operation capable of global reach, or at least more than they had imagined. And as they pressed deeper toward a chamber filled with low-humming generators and blinking consoles, the figure ahead paused briefly and looked back, gesturing insistently toward a partially blocked stairwell.